Today we're going to talk about how red blood cells work. We're going to talk about how they pick up oxygen, how they deliver it to cells, what they're made up of, all of that stuff. First thing we're going to write down in our notebook, which you probably already have, and you probably already know, is that red blood cells contain hemoglobin. Now, this is a pretty boring slide I have because on the next slide we'll talk a little bit more about hemoglobin. This hemoglobin is a molecule in RBC, that's red blood cell, and the hemoglobin is what actually transports the oxygen. If our red blood cells didn't have hemoglobin, they wouldn't be able to carry oxygen throughout our bloodstream. So hemoglobin is a molecule. Remember, everything's made up of atoms, and so this molecule has some carbon, some hydrogen, some oxygen, some nitrogen, and then you'll notice it has iron in the middle of it. And that iron is super important. That iron is going to help it actually carry the oxygen. So this is a kind of computer model of what that hemoglobin molecule looks like. Lots of different twists and turns there. So the important thing here is that it contains iron. Fe, that stands for iron. And this is important because we are going to find out that if you don't have enough iron, you can't make enough hemoglobin, and then your cells cannot transport oxygen. So we're going to take a look here with anemia, which you may have heard of. This is kind of a cartoon drawing of normal blood cells and then anemic blood cells. And I want you to tell me, what do you notice? You probably said there's fewer cells over here, there's fewer red blood cells over here, there's not this purple guy. Yep, totally. So we're going to write down with anemia, we don't have as many red blood cells. And we're going to flip to the page in our notebook. Hopefully you titled a page in your notebook, Diseases of the Circulatory System. If you haven't made a page for that now, flip to a new page. You can title it Diseases of the Circulatory System. And while we go throughout this unit, we're going to be coming back to this page and adding on diseases. So this disease is called anemia, and it's a condition where the body does not have enough iron to make hemoglobin. And so because they can't make enough hemoglobin, they then can't make enough red blood cells. So an easy way to test for this is they test how many red blood cells you have, they test how much hemoglobin you have, all of those different things. Now you can imagine that if your red blood cells are carrying oxygen, that when we don't have enough red blood cells, we can't carry as much oxygen. And as a result then, we're going to feel tired. And this often happens with physical activity. Feel more tired than normal, fatigued, and it's because you're not actually getting enough oxygen to your body cells. So we're going to flip back to our notes on red blood cells. Okay, we're done with diseases, and we're going to talk about how these red blood cells actually bring this oxygen, how they get the oxygen, all of that. So you probably know that you breathe in oxygen through your lungs, okay, and then you exhale carbon dioxide. So what happens is oxygen and carbon dioxide, they move using diffusion. We've talked about diffusion before. Remember, diffusion is when we go from a high concentration to a low concentration. Now, if we think about this in our lungs, when we're breathing in, we've got a high concentration of oxygen in our lungs. And our bloodstream is going to be picking up that oxygen. So let's take a look at how this happens. These are our lungs here, the little sacs that are in our lungs. We have our blood vessel here, our capillary. And we have, when we breathe in, a high concentration of oxygen in our lungs. And there's a lower concentration of oxygen in our blood vessels. So the oxygen moves via diffusion into our blood vessels. The opposite is true with carbon dioxide. Our blood vessels have picked up lots of carbon dioxide from our cells, transported it all the way to our lungs, there's a high concentration in our blood vessels and a low concentration in our lungs. So the CO2 moves from our blood vessels to our lungs, and then we breathe out that CO2. So everything works from high to low, diffusion. So go ahead and write this down. At the lungs, the blood cells are going to drop off this carbon dioxide, and they're going to pick up oxygen. So in our lungs, we've got these little air sacs, and they're called alveoli. And there are little capillaries next to them that serve to pick up and drop off carbon dioxide and oxygen. So this is the same pictures we saw on the previous slides, just a different representation. So this part's, the blue part's the lungs, and then this is our blood vessel. So our blood vessels are like highways, right? And they're going throughout our body, and they're picking up all the CO2 from the cells. So the cells have carbon dioxide as waste, and when they get to the lungs, they're going to drop off this CO2. We're going to breathe it out. And when we breathe in, there's lots of oxygen here, and the oxygen is going to go in to the bloodstream. So this is what happens at the lungs, okay? Our blood cells drop off CO2, they pick up oxygen, and then when they get to our body cells, right, the highways, at our cells, they're going to do a similar exchange. They need to get oxygen to the cells. So the blood cells are going to deliver the oxygen, and they're going to pick up the CO2 and then bring it all the way back to the lungs. So it's a constant exchange of oxygen and CO2, always from high to low. Okay, no matter if it's oxygen or CO2. You see as well, we've got glucose. We've talked about other things that our blood transports, like glucose and water. And it's always going to move from high to low. So this is how red blood cells end up transporting so many things throughout our body.